Language Arts Department summary of Chapter 9, Challenging Students to Think Critically. These are some additional techniques for questioning and responding to students.
Okay, one of the challenging ideas to have students to think critically is to remember to ask questions one at a time. And so when we ask more than one question, students often do not respond because they're unsure of which question you want them to answer, which will result in students sticking their head in books and avoiding the question. Another step is that asking one question at a time, this will allow students to focus on developing one idea at a time. Therefore, the thinking cap goes on. Another technique to help the teacher, it helps us to focus on questioning a specific goal or purpose in mind. Okay, so therefore, asking one question at a time, when students are asked more than one question, it is unclear for the students to answer which question. Fortunately, the solution is simple. You just need to ask one question at a time.
Simple to complex, engaging students. It's effective to ask questions that progress from simple to complex. Like good lesson plans, effective questions engage student thinking about a topic in contained and concrete ways, and then push them to think more deeply and broadly. The process of answering narrow and more focused questions gets students activating their memory about relevant facts and details to support their opinions. They have time to develop and reflect, turning their thoughts and ideas into insights before they're called on and share them with the class or in public. As a result, they'll likely answer more broad and deep questions more factually and more insightfully, and seeing that they've succeeded initially, more confidently and with a willingness to take on greater risks. So for example, you might ask a few fact-based questions to ensure your students understand the facts and details of what happened. These might be organized from the simple and then to the more complex. You might start asking students to evaluate and prioritize that information. What was the most important event of the story? What did we learn that most help us to understand the main character? What were the most important events in that historical period? And what do they tell you about people's values? After a while, you could move to questions that ask students to apply their ideas more broadly. How do you compare and contrast the main character behavior in this chapter compared to another point in the novel? What about some important lessons from that time period that still make sense today? While these latter types of questions are more interesting, though they won't be as valuable if you just jump right to them directly. You've got to build up students' logical and deeper thinking.
An additional technique from Chapter 9 regarding techniques for questioning and responding to students is called verbatim. Most teachers ask a question, wait for hands, and then call on a student to answer. However, before the chosen student answers, they often restate the question. Restating the question is critical, but it's important to remember to ask the same question word for word. Some teachers unintentionally pull a bait and switch on their students, changing the question after a student has raised his hand and begun to formulate an answer. For example, a change from, "Why do you think the author wrote this article?" to, "What was the purpose of this article?" may seem harmless to the teacher, but can have several negative consequences. Essentially, the student is now asked to respond aloud to a question that is different from what he volunteered to speak about. Not prepared, and the quality of the answer is likely to be lower. In addition, students will be less likely to take the risk of answering questions aloud in the future. Your questions matter. You want your students to hear them, consider them, and participate based on a thoughtful reflection. Make that easier for them by keeping the question constant. Repeat your questions verbatim.
Okay, I am doing 5 clear and concise techniques to improve the clarity of questions. Oftentimes in the classroom, we get a wrong answer, but the problem isn't with the answer, it sometimes is a problem with the question. For instance, we should always begin questions with who, when, what, where, why, or how. Because students immediately know it's a question and they begin thinking of a response, you increase the likelihood the answer will be clear. The next technique is to make questions rigorous and demanding, but limit them to 2 clauses. The third technique to consider is to, while you're lesson planning, script both questions and your responses if students aren't able to answer your question. Next, ask an actual question rather than make a statement to avoid confusion. And finally, assume the answer and avoid planting doubt. For instance, ask, "Who can tell me?" as opposed to, "Can anyone tell me?"
Sometimes, when teaching one concept again and again throughout a long period of time, teachers develop a series of stock questions that can be used throughout their lessons. Rather than generating new questions on the spot, these stock questions allow a teacher to work with students quickly and with rigor over an important concept. For example, a teacher that's working with students to identify a run-on sentence is going to use the same series of questions again and again, probably several times throughout his lesson, and with different students. These stock questions work on theme and variation, similar sequences of questions applied over and over again in different settings. They won't work in every situation, but stock questions can be an important part of your classroom. One last concern regarding questioning students is that of hit rate, the rate at which students answer your questions correctly. A hit rate of 100%, though feeling pretty good as a teacher, is not necessarily a good thing unless you've just wrapped up for review. If your kids are answering your questions at a 100% hit rate, chances are you need to start asking harder questions. Likewise, if your hit rate gets too low, say less than 2 out of 3 questions asked, you probably got a problem with the way you present a material or how you've aligned your questions for the kids. Try to have your hit rate fall somewhere between these 2 extremes.